Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. My name is Diana Skaya. The European Union is facing increasing pressure to mobilize frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction efforts, as Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk calls for action. But this may prove to be quite challenging. Now, how feasible is it to use these funds for Ukraine's recovery? To help us understand the complexities, I'm joined by Marek Madej, Department of Strategic Studies and International Security at the Faculty of Law at the University of Warsaw. Thanks for being here with us on World Talks on TVP World.
Good evening.
So, Marek, let me ask you this. Now, Polish Prime Minister Tusk has called on the EU to mobilize these Russian frozen assets to, of course, help Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. Now, how feasible do you actually think this is going to be? I mean, is it a viable solution for the EU?
Well, it could be problematic if we think about it in various, let's say, strictly legalistic terms, because every state has an immunity from such action as confiscation of their money located in other countries, especially if we talk about some form of investments, direct investments, and so on. Currently in Europe, there are from 2 to 300 billion of Russian $1 billion or euro, from Russian accounts, especially from Russian central bank, which are frozen. And what is relatively easy to be taken and to be used is so-called windfall gains from that kind of money. That is, things which, due to the fact that they were still in banks, they have some profits which grew on it. And that profits could be put on, let's say, another bank account, and profits from that profits could be used because they were not, let's say, envisaged in transaction that Russia done earlier. However, the problem is with that money, which are simply the money located in banks and frozen on bank accounts or other clearing agencies in Europe. And here, legality could be problematic, although there are some options. One of the options is simply to execute a decision of a court. If, for example, some court, which is recognized also by Russia, like something which deals, for example, with human rights, will decide that that could be a form of punishment. However, it will be definitely something which is a long procedure. There are a couple of other options, but especially if we think about it in strictly legal terms, they won't be options which could be done quickly and easily. Therefore, taking into account that we have to think about it rather as something which is, let's say, legitimate, not maybe legal, then we could simply do an action which is, let's say, simple executive or legislative action done by European Union, that is decision of European Union, with all consequences we could have of it. That is some kind of reciprocity. Yep.
So you're saying that it wouldn't be quick and easy, but now how long do you think it would actually take to have those Russian funds, those frozen Russian assets to actually work, for instance, for the EU, for EU defense?
As I said, if we decide to do it in form of, let's say, legislative decision of European bodies, then probably they could be used easier and relatively quickly. It's a question how easily it will be to agree within European Union, taking into account also the problems within European Union, that is the fact that not all countries will share that point of view, and that could be a problem. If we depends also what kind of decision it will be. Can we use here? Does it have to be something which has to be done with unanimity, that all countries has to vote for it, or maybe with some majority? So that's the one issue. But once we decide to go that way, it could happen relatively quickly. The problem is that it is, let's say, from legal point of view, relatively, it could cause some doubts, and also it will definitely met with some Russian reciprocal action towards companies or banks which have assets in Russia, for example.
What kind of resources are actually included in these frozen Russian assets? What can you tell us?
Well, as far as I know, there are mainly simply some bonds which were bought by Russian central bank in other countries. Also money which were frozen due to the transactions which were cleared and done in Europe. So they are simply different type of financial assets with different also time of let's say, duration of that kind of accounts. Nevertheless, majority of them serves as some form of reserves of Russian central bank.
Marek, you mentioned a little earlier on that not all countries in Europe would be able to agree to this. Let's talk about Hungary's stance. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I could assume that Hungary will oppose to that kind of procedure. Therefore, there is a problem. What kind of mechanism we could use in 2024? We did have some pretty much similar discussion concerning the benefits, as I said, that windfall gains from Russian frozen accounts. And currently it is working in that way that since Hungary didn't participate in the decision making of that process, it was assumed that they cannot stop, let's say, European Union from decision on what that money will be used, which were from, as I said, some kind of specific revenues which were achieved thanks to the fact that assets were frozen and they are still in banks. However, the problem is that, that it's not asset as such, it's revenues from that asset. It was easier to find that kind of solution. Therefore, I do not see clearly what kind of mechanism could be used here, which will not, let's say, raise doubts, although at the same time, if there is an agreement of majority of countries, I assume that we could find a mechanism which will allow European Union to do that in form of decision, some legislative decision, for example.
Marek, I want to take you here through a report that I have from Reuters where Russia could reportedly agree to use $300 billion of sovereign assets frozen in Europe for reconstruction in Ukraine, but actually that it might demand a portion of these funds to be allocated to the areas that it controls, right? Or that its forces took control of in Ukraine. Now, what implications does this actually have for the broader reconstruction efforts?
Well, if the money are used for reconstruction assets, for reconstruction of Ukraine, then there is a, let's say, justified claim that some of the assets should be used in territories under Russian occupation. But first and foremost, we could do a reconstruction when the war is ended. And the problem is that the war is not ended. So discussion about division of money and where they should be deployed, let's call it that way, could happen and details could be agreed. And as I said, it could be legitimate claim. For example, we'll talk about territories which are under occupation of Russia. However, assuming that, for example, that occupation will end, not when we talk about the situation when the aggressor is taking somebody else's territory and then require money for reconstruction of the territory. So I think that we are simply it's too early to talk about money for reconstruction. The issue is also for what purpose that money should be given. If we talk about frozen assets now, and there is a rather a will also to offer them to Ukraine for war fighting, not only for reconstruction. In case of reconstruction, it will be a bit also easier as far as the legal aspects of that are concerned, because it could be treated as some form of countermeasure for illegal action Russians did earlier, or some form of compensation of these damages they caused during the military conflict, and it could be even done by some judiciary decision by courts, international courts.
But don't you think
it
would probably take a long time to process? I mean, you just said if it's being done by judiciary courts.
Definitely. That's the problem, that if we want to do it fully legally, the problem is of immunity of a state. If we think about some decisions which are legitimate in political terms, but not maybe fully legal, or we have to do some innovative interpretation of current legal rules, then it will cause problems in that sense that it could be questioned somehow. But as I said, the problem is also of legitimacy of some claims issued by Russia, which, let's say, want to have very strict interpretation of some international regulations and then ignore other international regulations. So.
Marek, let's go to this potential or probable, mineral agreements between Ukraine and the United States, should that take place. How do you see that's going to affect the way Europe is going to approach supporting Ukraine?
Again, the problem is that we don't know exactly what kind of agreements it could be, but I do not see the reason to think in a way that it has to have, let's say, the direct impact on the decision of Europe if we want to support Ukraine or how we will support Ukraine or not. Currently, we are in a situation that the more probable is scenario in which Americans want at least maybe even not sustain the help and assistance they offer for now. So Ukraine could negotiate with United States the agreements concerning their own resources, and if Ukraine agrees on given conditions, then there is no point, let's say, of... Yeah.
But do you think that will really happen? For instance, if we just flash back to just a few days ago, and with everything that's taken place this entire week, from the Munich Security Conference to what happened in Paris to Saudi Arabia, do you think that Ukraine would actually find this, sit down and sign something with the United States with what you just said?
As for now, I think that it's less probable than it was a week ago. On the other hand, I cannot, let's say, fully assess to what kind of conditions could be really offered by the United States. The conditions we have heard, especially thanks to the Telegraph publication, are probably of that kind that they cannot be accepted by Ukraine. If the conditions change, I could assume that depends on also how much, let's say, Ukraine will take in return, and what kind of assistance could be guaranteed by that. Then agreement is could happen. But for now, I agree that the probability, with conditions already presented and let's say climate in relation between Ukraine and United States as for now, I think that it's not very probable to have that kind of agreement soon.
Thank you so much, Marek Madej, Department of Strategic Studies and International Security at the University of Warsaw, for being with us here on TVP World Talks this evening.
Thank you very much.
And that completes this edition of World Talks. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and do stay tuned on TVP World for more news and features.